So I'm going to read an excerpt from the story, The Event, Juan of Mycelia, first published in my short story collection with wonderful artists, Event Horizon Stories of No Turning Back, published by my imprint Janus Point Press, but also published in the wonderful the wonderful anthology Not Your Poppy's Utopia, Radical Visions of Latinx Hope. I think that's the full title. Forgive me as I take in this nature. And that was published by Mouthfeel Press. And I could not have imagined this was exactly the setting I hoped to find to do author reads to the Libyan Sea, to the rocks, to the birds, to the butterflies that are here, to the insects, to the sheep poo. I mean, it's spring. It's spring in southern Crete. So the event's on Juan of Mycelia. It was a thrice moonless night on Saraskechia, when from a patch of black sky adorned with gems of starlight that the grave mark of Don Juan of Mycelia begins. He descended from the Gytheros constellation, the same one he'd forever exit from during his brief visit on the planet that maimed the women of Belise's line, and many others on the planet. So indelible was his mark, his legend rewrote the myth and nomenclature of the Gytheros constellation, to Belise's consternation. It was now simply called Don Juan QR001. Light jumpers confirmed his mark on the planet through the lens of commodity. They had visited Saraskechia before his arrival for the star maps all star-traveling beings sought out from the planet. The maps were used as historical markers to project a future to travel toward, a necessity of navigating the quirk of time dilation. To Sarasketchians, though these exoplanet light jumpers would return to the planet hundreds of years later, to the light jumpers only a few months had passed. In the case of Don Juan, those who left Saraskechia before his visit had returned, hearing rumors of his legend, as they sat in pubs reorienting themselves with life since they'd left, before they collected new maps to venture out to the stars with again. In the pubs, they heard of Don Juan's visit, and as the whispers go, the maps, ever since Don Juan's event, possessed ever so slight but observable inaccuracies. The hydrogen content of such and such star was off in its projection, which meant that it did not evolve into a gentle bloated red dwarf, but collapsed into a tight electric magnetar, as the startled light jumper discovered when he exited from his jump. There were no injuries in that particular case, but the incident was shared and produced some hesitation in trusting the storied maps of the cartographers of Saraskechia for stars with particular solar masses, in fear that what they would arrive at would be a menacing star whose pull would spaghettify them into atomic noodles or rip from them all metallic elements of their body as they were simultaneously crushed into the size of an atomic speck of dust. The semantics meant something to Belise, not just because she was proud of the cartographer craft. There was nothing more noble than charting out the elements of the universe over an observer's point of time reference. It had meant something to Belise because of the weight she saw her line carry since the event of his visit. Don Juan was a stain. His event is more a series of events that compose a singular moment, and here are the rumors Belise herself heard, echoed of what it was. The woman took Don Juan as any other light jumper in search of a map, at first. But the first sign that he was different came when reports surfaced that he visited multiple telescopes. This was curious because once a quadrant was chosen, all other maps he collected would become obsolete once he light jumped to one. The past was always aging, and light jumpers collected maps for only themselves. They never traded. What also made these multi-telescope reports curious was that they were all reported to happen at the same time. However, each woman reported the same thing, that he traveled to their telescope, a figure walking down the hill towards the apothecary houses. But what about the flowers? Belise remembers asking the few with first-hand accounts from the women of what happened before these women stopped talking about the event. Ask the women that, the witness would answer, and they'll tell you that he gave the flowers no regard, trampling them as he approached. What's curious is how the women recount this without outcry. To Aunt Ebstorff, a petite woman who had a dislike of men of hovering height, as she didn't like to feel like a crumpled leaf under their bodies. To her, Don Juan was a modest 5 feet. To Grandmother Phoebe, Don Juan descended the hills a towering 7, as Grandmother Phoebe was a woman who delighted in being crushed by a man's rigid frame. According to the telescopes of Ern, he had lavender skin that matched their lavender flowers. The obelisk constellation remarked how his skin glowed onyx. Some said his head was bald and shiny like an emerald marble. Others, how it was trellised in thick curls to anchor your fingers in during the throes of pleasure. And so it went on. These variations on his account, but always the same narrative arc. How Don Juan walked into their life for a night and left a vacuum in their hearts with his absence. Though dominant in frequency, it was not just corporal pleasure that these women reported of the incident when they talked about what happened before sorrow closed these stories inside of them. For some women, it was a night of careful sewing of maps that he did with them. Others said he sat on a chair and listened to their poetry, smiling after each recited stanza. Almeda, a notorious bookworm, said that with her, Don Juan simply read a book of his own on the couch, while she read another in her reading chair. She, like Kira, got the worst of his affliction. Since then, she was never able to read again. Kira had spent the night solving galaxy rotation equations with him, and after this night could no longer count to 10. Still, for most of the women, there was a hushed omission of what exactly Don Juan of Mycelia did with them during that night. But the consensus was that he delivered somatic pleasure that rivaled anything the women had ever experienced before. And then he simply left, right back into the Gytheros constellation, but at such speed that he entered the time dilation paradox that places fast objects to the perspective of a stationary observer as moving slowly through time. For these women who looked into the sky, for him, they saw him leaving at an excruciatingly slow speed. It amounted to torture. To the inhabitants of Sarasketchia who peered through the Gytheros telescope, the dot in the sky, red shifted, denoting that an object was moving away from an observer, was Don Juan freshly leaving them. Yes, the sky was filled with other light jumpers leaving with their maps and Sarasketchian cartographers on their ascensions, but the only light jumper that mattered to these women was the one named Don Juan. On Sarasketchia, there were flowers to smell to balm the disappointments of a lost locket. Flowers for lovers to forget their mutual infidelities. Flowers indeed for unrequited and lost loves. But there was no flower on Sarasketchia that would erase the memory of Don Juan. You can keep recording because, thank you for listening. All names in my stories have meaning, and certainly the women's names in these stories hold meaning. Female names of famous cartographers, female cartographers throughout history in some form. But here's a little inside tip. The Gytheros constellation of Don Juan that emerged in Greek means donkey. Thank you.
Let's go further must never stop.